Before we start the video, I have a very important message for you. Our channel needs your support. If you enjoy incredible stories about vintage aircraft, legendary battles, and everything related to the great wars of the past, you're in the right place. But to keep bringing you this kind of content, we need your subscription. So, if you haven't subscribed yet, take a moment to do it now, and help us keep sharing more amazing content with you here on the channel.
Before World War II became a global inferno, the skies were already shifting with winds of change. In the late 1930s, the rapid development of aviation technology, spurred by rearmament programs across Europe and Asia, created a race for air superiority. The United States, still reeling from the Great Depression, had a relatively small air force, and its aircraft were quickly becoming outdated. It was in this climate of growing urgency that the Curtiss-Wright Corporation introduced what would become one of the most iconic American fighters of the Second World War, the P-40 Warhawk. The P-40 didn't begin its life as a revolutionary design. It was in many ways a compromise, an evolution rather than a reinvention. Its development was rooted in the earlier Curtiss P-36 Hawk, an aircraft that had shown promise but was ultimately being eclipsed by faster, more powerful designs overseas. The Army Air Corps was desperate for a more capable fighter, but development, time and budget constraints made the idea of creating an entirely new airframe impractical. So instead, engineers at Curtiss opted to re-engineer the existing P-36 frame by integrating a liquid-cooled Allison V1710 engine. This decision marked a significant shift. Most American fighters at the time used air-cooled radial engines. The Allison engine, however, was an inline V12 design, offering a sleeker profile and better aerodynamics. The resulting aircraft, the XP-40 prototype, first flew in October 1938. It wasn't perfect, but it showed promise. With a top speed of just over 340 mph, it was faster than the P-36 and many of its contemporaries. The Army Air Corps, seeing potential in the design, ordered an initial batch of 524 units in 1939, making it the largest aircraft order from the U.S. government since World War I. However, there were challenges. The Allison engine lacked a two-stage supercharger, limiting the P-40's performance at higher altitudes. This would prove a persistent handicap, especially in the European theater. But in 1939 and 1940, with war erupting in Europe and China, under siege from Japanese forces, the United States needed fighters, and it needed them fast. The P-40 was the only American design that could be put into mass production immediately. By 1940, as the war in Europe intensified, foreign interest in the P-40 grew. Britain, having suffered heavy losses in the Battle of France and preparing for the looming threat of German invasion, was eager to buy American aircraft to replenish its depleted squadrons. The British Purchasing Commission placed a significant order for P-40s, designating them as Tomahawks. These early exports helped Curtiss improve production and refine the aircraft's systems. Meanwhile, the U.S. continued ramping up its own orders in anticipation of being drawn into the conflict. The P-40's first combat came not with American pilots, but with the Royal Air Force in North Africa. There it was tested against German and Italian fighters in brutal desert conditions. The aircraft quickly gained a reputation for its ruggedness. It could take punishment and still return to base, something pilots valued highly. While it struggled to match the performance of the Messerschmitt Bf 109 at high altitudes, it performed admirably at low to medium levels, especially in ground attack roles. Its heavy armament, typically 650 caliber machine guns, made it a formidable opponent in the right hands. But perhaps the most famous chapter of the P-40's early history was written not in Europe, but in the skies over China. In 1941, With war spreading across the globe and the US still officially neutral, a group of American volunteers began arriving in Burma and China. They were the American Volunteer Group, or AVG, more famously known as the Flying Tigers. Recruited under the leadership of Claire Lee Chennault, a former U.S. Army Air Corps officer and staunch advocate of fighter aircraft in the China theater, these pilots were tasked with defending Chinese cities and supply routes from Japanese air raids. The AVG flew P-40B models, many of which were shipped to China under Lend-Lease agreements. Their planes were instantly recognizable by their iconic shark-mouth nose art, a design borrowed from British units flying the aircraft in North Africa. Despite being outnumbered and operating far from reliable logistics or airfields, the Flying Tigers made an enormous impact. Their aggressive tactics, coupled with the P-40's diving speed and durability, allowed them to claim an impressive kill-to-loss ratio. What the P-40 lacked in high-altitude performance, it made up for in speed, during a dive, and in its ability to absorb damage. These qualities suited the ambush-style tactics Chennault favored. Rather than engage in dogfights, AVG pilots would use altitude to their advantage, diving onto enemy formations and retreating before the Japanese fighters, typically lighter and more maneuverable but more fragile, could respond effectively. By the time the United States officially entered the war following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the P-40 was already a veteran. Curtiss had continued to improve the design, with new variants like the P-40D and P-40E offering better engines, more armor, and increased firepower. These models became the backbone of American fighter forces in the early war years. As the United States mobilized for global conflict, the Warhawk would go on to see action in nearly every theater, from the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of New Guinea, and from the Aleutian Islands to the skies over Italy. It would be flown by American, British, Australian, New Zealand, Soviet, and Chinese pilots. Though never the fastest or most advanced fighter of the war, its reliability, versatility, and sheer availability made it a critical component of the Allied air strategy. And it all began with a decision to upgrade an existing design to create not a revolutionary new fighter, but a dependable workhorse. The P-40 Warhawk was, in many ways, a symbol of American industrial pragmatism. Tough, adaptable, and always ready to fight. As the United States plunged into World War II, following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, American air power faced an uphill battle. Much of the aircraft inventory was either outdated or unproven in sustained combat. The P-40 Warhawk, while already tested by the British and the Flying Tigers, was now thrust into the forefront of American air campaigns. It quickly became the primary frontline fighter across several theaters during the early years of the war. One of the first major combat deployments of the P-40 under U.S. command came in the Philippines. There, a surprise attack by the Japanese Air Force devastated American airfields and caught much of the U.S. Far East Air Force on the ground. Despite the losses, a handful of P-40s managed to get airborne and engage incoming enemy bombers and fighters. The aircraft's speed in a dive and firepower allowed some pilots to score early victories, but they were vastly outnumbered and quickly overwhelmed. The fall of the Philippines was a harsh lesson in preparedness, but it also revealed the resilience of the Warhawk in the hands of determined pilots. In the months that followed, the P-40 became the workhorse of the U.S. Army Air Forces in the Pacific. In the Dutch East Indies and Australia, it was the primary air defense against Japanese incursions. The Warhawk's durability proved crucial in tropical environments. Operating from rough airstrips with minimal maintenance, it continued to perform. Australian pilots, flying P-40s designated as Kitty Hawks, defended Darwin and engaged enemy forces across Papua New Guinea, where their reliability and ruggedness earned deep respect. One pilot who rose to prominence flying the P-40 was Colonel Robert Scott, Assigned to China after the US entry into the war, Scott initially expected to be part of a bomber unit. Instead, he found himself flying fighters. He formed the 23rd Fighter Group, which replaced the disbanded Flying Tigers and became one of the early American aces in China. His book, God is My Co-Pilot, captured the spirit of the American air war in Asia and highlighted the strengths of the P-40. Scott frequently described how the aircraft, while not as agile as Japanese planes, allowed him to strike hard and escape thanks to its diving speed and structural strength. Meanwhile, in North Africa, the P-40 played a critical role during the Allied campaign against Axis forces. Beginning with Operation Torch in late 1942, US forces landed in Morocco and Algeria, linking up with British units already fighting in the deserts of Egypt and Libya. The P-40 flew escort missions, supported ground troops, and engaged German and Italian aircraft over the desert. The harsh environment of the North African theater tested every aspect of an airplane's durability, and the P-40 excelled. Its simple construction and rugged landing gear made it ideal for desert airstrips where dust and grit wore down more delicate machines. In combat, Warhawk pilots learned to fight smart. German fighters like the Bf-109 were generally faster and had better climb rates, but the P-40 could hold its own at low altitudes. American pilots adopted tactics similar to the Flying Tigers: use hit-and-run attacks, dive aggressively, and avoid turning dogfights. The aircraft's 650 caliber machine guns delivered devastating firepower in brief bursts, often shredding enemy planes in seconds. Among the notable American P-40 aces in North Africa was Lieutenant Colonel William Leverett, who achieved one of the most remarkable single missions of the war in October 1943. While flying a P-40, Leverett led a flight of aircraft that intercepted a formation of German Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers. In a matter of minutes, his group destroyed 17 enemy aircraft, with Leverett personally credited with downing 7. It was a stunning display of aerial dominance made possible by the aggressive use of the Warhawk strengths. In another part of the globe, the China-Burma-India theater, often overshadowed by Europe and the Pacific, became one of the most grueling and logistically challenging environments of the war. There, the P-40 was a lifeline. Flying from primitive bases, pilots fought to defend supply routes like the Hump, the dangerous aerial route over the Himalayas used to bring aid into China. The P-40s protected transport planes from Japanese fighters and frequently strafed enemy ground positions in support of Chinese troops. They faced high terrain, bad weather, and persistent enemy pressure. Yet the Warhawk endured. Despite its age, the P-40 continued to receive updates. Variants like the P-40F and P-40N featured improvements in engine performance, weight reduction, and visibility from the cockpit. These changes helped prolong the aircraft's frontline service, even as newer fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang began to dominate American production lines. Perhaps what most defined the P-40's legacy during this period was not just its combat record, but the connection pilots felt to the machine. It was a plane that inspired loyalty. While not the fastest or most glamorous, it was dependable. In battle, that reliability often meant the difference between life and death. Pilots knew they could push it hard, take hits, and still bring it home. That sense of trust would carry the Warhawk forward into more missions and more skies as the war expanded, and the P-40 refused to be left behind. As the Pacific theater became the focus of some of the most intense and brutal fighting of World War II, the P-40 Warhawk remained an integral part of the Allied air strategy. Though increasingly outclassed by newer fighters in Europe, the Warhawk found new life over the coral islands, steaming jungles, and volcanic ridges of the Pacific. It became a symbol of resilience and adaptability in a theater defined by unforgiving terrain, and long, grinding campaigns. Nowhere was the Warhawk's persistence more apparent than in New Guinea. In 1942 and 1943, the battle for control of this rugged, jungle-covered island was fierce. Japanese forces had established a series of strongholds and airfields, most notably at Lae and Buna, from which they launched attacks across the island and toward Australia. American and Australian forces were determined to halt their advance, and they relied heavily on the P-40 to do it. Operating from primitive airfields carved out of jungle clearings and muddy plains, P-40s flew relentless missions. They bombed and strafed enemy positions, protected supply convoys, and engaged Japanese fighters in the sky. The tropical environment was a constant enemy. Rain, heat, humidity, and insects corroded equipment and wore down engines. But the Warhawk's simple design made it easier to maintain than many of its contemporaries. Mechanics could patch it up in the field. Pilots could count on it to deliver firepower where it was needed most. In this environment, a new generation of P-40 aces emerged. One of the most notable was Richard Bong, though he would later transition to flying the P-38 Lightning. His early missions in the Warhawk helped shape his aggressive style. Another was Major John Landers, who earned his first victories in the P-40 before becoming one of the most successful American aces in Europe. These pilots learned to use the P-40's strengths to their advantage: its rugged construction, diving, speed, and firepower were ideal for quick, punishing raids on enemy ground positions and aircraft formations. The Warhawk also played a crucial role in the Solomon Islands campaign, particularly during the battles for Guadalcanal and the surrounding islands. The fight for Guadalcanal was one of the turning points in the Pacific War, and air superiority was vital. While the Navy relied on F-4F Wildcats launched from carriers, the Army Air Forces operated P-40s from makeshift bases on the island itself. These aircraft supported the Marines on the ground, engaged in dogfights with Japanese Zeros, and disrupted enemy supply lines. Though the Mitsubishi A6M0 had the edge in maneuverability and climb rate, the P-40 could still win a fight with the right tactics. American pilots learned to avoid turning engagements and instead relied on energy fighting, using superior diving speed to strike and escape. The aircraft's armor protection also made it more survivable than the lightly built Japanese fighters, which often burst into flames under heavy machine gun fire. Throughout 1943 and into 1944, the P-40 remained a vital component of Allied air power in the Pacific. Its ground attack capabilities became more important than ever as island-hopping campaigns intensified. In places like the Gilbert Islands, the Marshall Islands, and later the Marianas, P-40s flew sorties to suppress enemy defenses before landings, escorted bombers, and provided close air support for advancing infantry. In addition to its performance in combat, the P-40 earned a reputation among Allied ground troops as a lifesaver. Soldiers on the front lines frequently witnessed Warhawks, screaming down from the sky to strafe enemy bunkers, columns, and airfields. Its menacing shark-mouth nose, still popular among many units, became a symbol of vengeance from above. Troops grew to love the sound of those 650 caliber machine guns echoing over the battlefield, often turning the tide during desperate engagements. Meanwhile, Curtiss continued producing updated versions of the Warhawk to meet evolving demands. The P-40N, introduced in 1943, was the most produced variant, with more than 13,000 units built. It featured a lighter airframe, improved speed and climb rate, and better cockpit visibility, crucial for situational awareness in chaotic Pacific skies. Despite the emergence of more advanced fighters like the P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt, the Warhawk remained in widespread use due to its reliability and sheer availability. Internationally, Allied forces continued to deploy the P-40 wherever American support reached. New Zealand pilots flew Kitty Hawks in the Pacific, supporting operations alongside American units. Soviet pilots flew Lend-Lease P-40s on the Eastern Front, where the aircraft's ruggedness and firepower proved valuable in lower-altitude missions against German bombers and ground targets. Even after newer aircraft were introduced, the Warhawk remained a first-choice fighter in many secondary theaters. As the war pushed closer to Japan, the P-40 began to fade from frontline service in favor of longer-range, more powerful fighters. But it still played a key role in places where infrastructure was lacking or where the battle was close to the ground. It was often one of the first aircraft to arrive on a newly captured island and the last to leave when the airstrip was shut down. Beyond the statistics and specs, the Warhawk's true legacy in the Pacific lies in the countless stories of bravery and endurance associated with it. Pilots who flew it didn't see it as a glamorous thoroughbred, but rather as a trusted partner, a machine that could take abuse and keep fighting. It was the blue-collar hero of the air war, and its contribution to the Pacific victory cannot be overstated. From the steaming jungles of New Guinea to the coral runways of tiny atolls, the P-40 Warhawk earned its stripes in blood and sweat. And though the war would eventually pass it by in favor of more modern machines, the echoes of its engine and the bark of its guns would live on in the memories of those who survived because of it. While the P-40 Warhawk never truly became a frontline air superiority fighter in Western Europe due to its limitations at high altitudes, it still played a significant and sometimes overlooked role in secondary European fronts and in the hands of many foreign air forces. Its adaptability and durability made it invaluable in regions where infrastructure was lacking or where newer, more advanced fighters were not yet available. One of the most important theaters for the P-40 in Europe was the Mediterranean. After the successful campaign in North Africa, Allied forces turned their attention to Sicily and mainland Italy. These campaigns demanded a mix of air support roles, close air support, ground attack, bomber escort, and interception missions. Although aircraft, like the P-51 and P-47, began to arrive in greater numbers, the P-40 still bore much of the burden, particularly in the earlier stages of the Italian campaign. Flying from rough airfields in Sicily and southern Italy, P-40 squadrons delivered punishing blows against German ground positions and transport columns. The aircraft's ability to operate from forward positions and absorb battle damage made it a reliable option for these dangerous missions. Its 650 caliber machine guns and underwing bombs allowed it to devastate enemy fortifications, armor and troop movements. The Luftwaffe still posed a significant threat in these regions, but the Warhawk held its own when used with proper tactics, diving attacks, fast exits, and tight squadron coordination. One memorable engagement occurred during the 1943 campaign, near Salerno, where P-40s flew continuous sorties to protect Allied troops from enemy counterattacks. Flying in coordination with naval gunfire and artillery observers, Warhawk pilots took on the role of battlefield guardians, striking German concentrations and armored vehicles before they could overwhelm beachhead positions. Though the missions were exhausting and dangerous, they were vital to securing a foothold in southern Europe. The P-40 also found success in the Balkans. In support of Yugoslav partisan forces resisting Axis occupation, the Warhawk was used to attack German supply routes and small garrisons in mountainous terrain. These missions required precision flying and rugged aircraft that could take damage and still return. The P-40's reputation as a survivable machine made it the aircraft of choice for these sorties, where the margin for error was razor-thin. One of the most widespread users of the P-40 outside the United States was the Soviet Union. Through the Lend-Lease program, thousands of P-40s were shipped across the Arctic and through the Persian corridor into the USSR. Soviet pilots flew the aircraft under brutal conditions, from snow-covered airstrips to muddy forward bases. While the Warhawk was not a favorite among Soviet aces who preferred aircraft like the Yak-3 and La-5, it filled an important gap in the early years of the war. Soviet P-40s were used primarily in lower-altitude roles, intercepting German bombers and attacking ground targets. In this capacity, the aircraft's firepower and toughness stood out. It could survive significant damage from enemy flak or machine gun fire and still return to base. The Red Air Force often removed certain equipment to lighten the aircraft and improve maneuverability. In Soviet hands, the Warhawk became a utility fighter, used wherever it was needed most, and praised for its reliability in some of the harshest flying conditions on Earth. In China, the P-40 continued to serve long after its retirement in other theaters. As part of the China Air Task Force and later the 14th Air Force, American pilots flew P-40s against Japanese positions across central and southern China. These missions were grueling. Pilots flew long distances over mountainous terrain, with little support, often relying on outdated maps and makeshift navigation, yet the Warhawk endured. It remained the primary air defense for Chinese cities and strategic supply routes well into 1944. One notable story from this period was the service of pilots like David Lee Tex Hill, who began his career with the Flying Tigers and continued to fly P-40s throughout the war. Hill's leadership and flying skills became legendary. He often led daring attacks against enemy airfields and convoys, demonstrating how the P-40 could still dominate in the right hands. Stories like his helped cement the Warhawk's mythical status in the China-Burma-India theater. Australia and New Zealand also relied heavily on the P-40. Australian squadrons flew Kitty Hawks in defense of their homeland, notably during Japanese raids on the northern coast, including Darwin. Later, they joined US forces in the Pacific Island hopping campaigns. New Zealanders, too, operated P-40s in the Solomon Islands, using them in both air-to-air combat and ground attack roles. In both cases, pilots praised the aircraft's robustness and firepower, which suited the Pacific's harsh operational environment. Even in Latin America, the P-40 found users. Several South American countries received Warhawks as part of hemisphere defense agreements, where they served as patrol aircraft and trainer platforms. Though they saw little combat in these regions, their presence represented the global reach and strategic importance of the aircraft, as newer aircraft like the P-47, P-51, and F-6F Hellcat began to dominate the skies by late 1944, the P-40 was gradually moved to secondary roles. But it never disappeared entirely. Its final missions were often flown in support of troops on the ground, targeting enemy bunkers, railways, and supply lines. In some areas, it continued to serve until the very end of the war, outlasting many aircraft introduced after it. By 1945, the Warhawk was no longer the sleek new weapon it had once been. It had aged, evolved, and earned its place in history, not by being the best, but by being the most available, most trusted, and most battle-tested. In all, more than 13,000 P-40s were built, serving in more than 24 countries and flying in virtually every corner of the globe. Its legacy extended far beyond dogfights. It was a trainer, a bomber escort, a ground attacker, a defender of supply lines, and a symbol of hope for many embattled regions. And through its many missions, it never ceased to deliver. As World War II drew to a close, the mighty P-40 Warhawk was slowly retired from frontline duties, replaced by faster, higher-flying, and longer-range aircraft that marked the next generation of combat aviation. Yet, despite being technologically outpaced, the Warhawk left an enduring legacy, one built not on dominance, but on determination, loyalty, and the countless pilots and mechanics who trusted the aircraft with their lives. By 1945, air combat had shifted dramatically. The introduction of long-range escort fighters like the P-51 Mustang changed the nature of air warfare. High-altitude bomber formations now had protection all the way to their targets in Germany or Japan. Jet aircraft such as the German Me-262 and British Gloster Meteor had taken to the skies, signaling a new era. Against these developments, the P-40, a design rooted in the late 1930s, had simply reached the limits of its potential. But that didn't diminish what it had accomplished. The Warhawk had served in more theaters than nearly any other fighter of the war. From the deserts of North Africa to the icy tundras of Russia, from the rainforests of Burma to the beaches of the South Pacific, it had flown in every major combat zone. It had battled the Zero over the Coral Sea, strafed German convoys in Italy, defended supply routes over the Himalayas, and escorted bombers through monsoon storms in China. Few aircraft could claim such a diverse resume. What made the P-40 truly special was its ability to adapt. Though its Allison engine lacked a high-altitude supercharger, it excelled in lower-altitude missions, where most actual combat occurred. In the Pacific and Mediterranean, it was fast enough to outrun trouble in a dive, strong enough to absorb punishment from flak and fighters, and armed heavily enough to shred enemy planes and fortifications. Pilots admired its straightforward handling and the confidence it inspired. It was the aircraft that allowed new pilots to cut their teeth and veteran aces to rack up kills. Many of those aces started in P-40 cockpits before moving on to more advanced fighters, but they never forgot the Warhawk. For countless American, British, Australian, Soviet, Chinese, and New Zealander pilots, the P-40 was their first love. The aircraft that introduced them to war, carried them through their formative missions, and brought them home when everything else fell apart. The maintenance crews, too, had deep respect for the Warhawk. It was relatively easy to repair in the field, with straightforward systems and a tough airframe that forgave mistakes. In the rough environments of forward airstrips, surrounded by mud, sand, or jungle, mechanics could keep the P-40 flying when other aircraft might be grounded. Its landing gear, built to withstand hard desert landings, worked just as well on coral runways or frozen Soviet soil. Beyond the war, the P-40 found extended life in smaller air forces around the world. Surplus models were sold or donated to countries in South America, Africa, and Asia, where they continued to serve into the early 1950s. Though no longer cutting edge, they offered nations an affordable way to develop air power. In these places, the Warhawk's ruggedness again made it an asset, just as it had been in 1941. In the United States, the end of the war brought the P-40 into civilian hands. Some were scrapped, but others were bought by collectors, racers, and museums. Slowly, the aircraft transitioned from war machine to historical artifact. Today, restored P-40s still fly at air shows across the world, often painted in the iconic shark mouth design of the Flying Tigers. Their engines still roar, their guns now silent, a tribute to the legacy they carved into history. What is perhaps most remarkable is how the P-40 endures in memory, not as a flawless machine, but as a fighter that stood its ground when the odds were stacked high. It symbolized the scrappy determination of the early war years, when Allied pilots had to fight tooth and nail with whatever they had. The Warhawk wasn't a miracle weapon. It was the fighter that met the moment. That legacy is also cemented in literature and film. Stories like God is My Co-Pilot and Flying Tigers introduced the P-40 to a post-war generation, casting it as a symbol of courage, ingenuity, and raw fighting spirit. These tales, often told with reverence, captured the deep emotional connection between pilot and plane. It was more than aluminum and rivets. It was a companion, a protector, a symbol of survival. From a historical perspective, the P-40 Warhawk occupies a unique place. It wasn't the fastest, it wasn't the most maneuverable, it wasn't even the most advanced, but it was there when it mattered most. In 1941, when America entered a global war, it was the Warhawk that stood ready. It was the Warhawk that flew in the Philippines, in China, in New Guinea, and in North Africa. It was the Warhawk that first brought the fight to the enemy and held the line until better tools could arrive. In total, over 13,700 P-40s were built between 1939 and 1944. They flew under many names: Tomahawk, Kitty Hawk, Warhawk. But no matter the designation, their spirit remained the same. They were workhorses, survivors, warriors. Today, the sound of a P-40 engine starting up at an air show might draw a crowd of curious onlookers. But for those who know, who remember, or who study the great aerial battles of World War II, that sound means something more. It is the echo of a time when young pilots climbed into cramped cockpits, not knowing if they would return. When mechanics worked through the night under makeshift tarps, when dusty runways, muddy fields, and broken airfields became launch pads for missions that changed the course of history. It is the sound of the Warhawk rising again.